Imagine trying to explain the modern idea of virginity to someone living 40,000 years ago, someone with no written language, no formal marriage contract, no religious doctrine handed down from a book, no medical concept of anatomy beyond what you can directly see and feel. Would they understand what you were talking about at all? Would the idea even make sense to them? Or would it land as a strange, culturally specific obsession that says more about the society asking the question than about anything universal in human biology or human nature? This turns out to be a genuinely fascinating question, because virginity, unlike something like fear or jealousy or grief, isn't a raw biological state in any straightforward sense. There's no organ, no hormone, no evolved instinct specifically producing virginity the way there's a nervous system producing fear. It's a concept, a category humans impose onto a biological fact, whether or not someone has had sexual intercourse. And the honest, well-documented answer from anthropology and history is that how that category gets defined, how much it matters, who it applies to, and what it's actually believed to indicate, varies so dramatically across human cultures that the modern Western understanding of virginity turns out to be one specific cultural invention among many genuinely different ways humans have handled this same basic biological fact. Let's start with what actually needs explaining here, because the question itself splits into two genuinely separate parts that are worth untangling carefully. First, did ancient and traditional human societies track and care about whether someone had previously had sexual intercourse? And second, did they attach the specific cluster of meanings modern society often attaches to that fact: purity, moral worth, a physical marker supposedly detectable through anatomy, a woman's value in marriage negotiations? These are genuinely different questions, and the anthropological evidence gives considerably different answers to each one. On the first question, the evidence is fairly clear. Some awareness of and social interest in a person's prior sexual history shows up across an enormous range of documented human societies, which makes sense once you connect it back to something we've already covered on this channel: the paternity uncertainty problem. In societies organized around pair bonding, inheritance, and paternal investment in offspring, a woman's sexual history before marriage carried genuine, practical information relevant to exactly the paternity concerns we discussed previously, since a pregnancy discovered shortly after marriage, if the woman had prior sexual partners, could introduce exactly the kind of uncertainty that threatened a husband's confidence in his own paternity. This gives a straightforward, non-mystical, practically grounded reason why virginity at marriage specifically, rather than sexual history in some abstract moral sense, became a socially tracked and often socially significant fact in a wide range of historical societies organized around this kind of family structure. But here's where the second question gets genuinely interesting, because the specific meanings layered on top of that practical concern vary enormously. And some of the most confident modern assumptions about ancient beliefs turn out to be considerably shakier than popular culture usually assumes. Let's talk about the hymen directly, because a huge amount of historical and even some persisting modern belief about virginity centers on the idea that it's physically, anatomically verifiable, specifically through the presence or absence of an intact hymen. And this belief has a genuinely long history across multiple ancient cultures, alongside a genuinely important scientific correction that's worth spending real time on. Ancient societies, including ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and numerous cultures across the medieval and early modern periods, developed formal or informal customs around checking for evidence of virginity, sometimes involving inspection of bedsheets after a wedding night for blood as supposed physical proof, a practice documented across an enormous geographic range and considerable historical depth. The problem, and this is genuinely important, is that modern anatomical and medical research has thoroughly established that this belief rests on a fundamentally flawed premise. The hymen is a thin, highly variable membrane that differs enormously in shape, size, and elasticity from person to person, doesn't necessarily rupture or bleed during first intercourse at all, can be affected by physical activity, tampons, or other non-sexual causes entirely unrelated to intercourse, and provides no reliable, medically verifiable evidence of sexual history whatsoever. Multiple contemporary medical organizations, including statements issued by the World Health Organization specifically addressing so-called virginity testing, have explicitly stated there is no valid medical basis for determining whether a person has previously had intercourse through physical examination at all, which means an enormous amount of historical and even some ongoing cultural weight has been placed on a physical sign that, by modern medical understanding, never actually reliably existed as verifiable evidence in the first place. Ancient and traditional societies weren't detecting a real, consistent biological marker. They were, in many documented cases, enforcing a social and often religiously significant belief system around a biological misunderstanding, sometimes with consequences for women that were genuinely severe when the expected physical proof simply failed to appear for reasons having nothing to do with actual sexual history at all. Now let's go considerably further back to see whether this concept, in any recognizable form, actually stretches into deep prehistory the way some assumptions about universal human nature might suggest, or whether it's a considerably more recent cultural development tied to specific kinds of social organization. This is where the anthropological picture gets genuinely more varied than most people expect walking in. Anthropologists studying small-scale hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living approximation to how humans organized socially for the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, have documented enormous variation in attitudes toward premarital sexual activity. And a meaningful number of studied cultures show attitudes considerably more permissive than the intense virginity-focused frameworks associated with many later agricultural and urban civilizations. Among the Trobriand Islanders, extensively studied by anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski in the early 20th century, premarital sexual activity among unmarried young people was documented as broadly accepted and unremarkable within the culture's own framework, without the intense moral or social weight attached to premarital virginity that characterized many contemporary Western societies at the exact same historical moment Malinowski was conducting his fieldwork. This doesn't mean the Trobriand Islanders had no sexual customs, rules, or social expectations at all. They absolutely did. But the specific intense focus on premarital virginity as a marker of moral worth or marriageability, treated as something approaching a fixed universal human concern in a lot of casual modern assumption, turns out to be considerably more culturally specific and considerably less universal than that assumption suggests. This pattern shows up again across a genuinely wide range of documented traditional societies with different underlying social and economic structures. Anthropological research broadly suggests a meaningful correlation between the intensity of virginity-focused sexual regulation in a given society and the presence of significant private property, inheritance systems, and formalized paternal wealth transfer specifically tied to confirmed biological lineage. Societies organized around exactly this kind of inheritance structure, where a father's accumulated property, land, or status needed to pass specifically to his confirmed biological offspring, show considerably more intense formal and legal concern with female virginity and premarital chastity than societies with more collective resource sharing, more flexible kinship structures, or belief systems like the partible paternity we discussed previously that reduce or reframe the practical stakes of paternity certainty entirely. This connects the virginity concept directly back to the same underlying evolutionary and economic logic driving the broader infidelity punishment systems we've already covered, suggesting that intense premarital virginity concern isn't a universal, timeless human preoccupation baked into our biology, but something that emerges specifically and fairly predictably wherever agricultural surplus, private property, and paternal inheritance systems develop together. Here's a detail that genuinely complicates the popular picture even further, because it's worth being honest about how differently this concept applied across gender lines historically, in ways that reveal a lot about what was actually being tracked and why. Across an enormous range of historical societies that did formally value virginity, the concern was overwhelmingly, often exclusively, focused on female virginity specifically, with little to no equivalent formal concern for male virginity or premarital chastity at all. This asymmetry maps directly onto the paternity uncertainty logic once again. Male virginity carries no equivalent practical information relevant to paternity confidence, since a man's prior sexual history has no bearing whatsoever on whether a future child is genetically his. The intense historical fixation on female virginity specifically, rather than premarital chastity as some kind of universal, gender-neutral moral value, is itself strong evidence that the underlying concern was never really about morality or purity in the abstract sense so often claimed by the belief systems built around it. It was, underneath the religious and moral framing layered on top, a practically motivated concern about paternity confidence and inheritance security, dressed up in whatever cultural and religious language a given society happened to have available to articulate and enforce it. There's also a genuinely interesting linguistic and conceptual detail worth including here, because the very idea of virginity as a single, coherent, universal concept starts to look considerably shakier once you look closely at how different languages and cultures have actually defined the boundary of what counts. Some historical, legal, and religious traditions defined virginity strictly around penetrative vaginal intercourse specifically, while other sexual activities were considered irrelevant to virginity status entirely. A definitional choice that itself reveals the concept was constructed around specific reproductive and paternity concerns rather than some broader, more coherent idea of sexual purity as commonly assumed. Other cultures and belief systems have defined the boundary differently, sometimes more broadly, sometimes more narrowly, which means even within societies that did formally value the concept, there was never full agreement across history about what specifically counted as crossing that line in the first place, a genuinely striking level of inconsistency for something so often treated, both historically and in some ongoing modern contexts, as though it were an obvious, fixed, universally understood category rather than a constructed one. So where does this leave the actual honest answer to the question we open with? The evidence suggests something more layered than a simple yes or no. Ancient and traditional human societies organized around pair bonding, paternal investment, and inheritance almost certainly did track and care about sexual history in ways connected to legitimate, practically grounded paternity concerns, and this concern likely stretches back a considerable distance into human prehistory alongside the broader jealousy and mate-guarding systems we've already covered on this channel. But the specific modern concept of virginity, treated as a coherent, physically verifiable, morally weighted category applied with particular intensity and asymmetry to women specifically, appears to be a considerably more variable, culturally constructed elaboration on top of that underlying practical concern, one that intensifies specifically alongside the emergence of private property and formal inheritance, appears far less pronounced or entirely absent in a meaningful number of documented small-scale societies without that same economic structure, and rests, in its most physically confident historical form, the hymen as verifiable proof, on a biological premise that modern medicine has since thoroughly debunked. There's something worth sitting with here as we close this out, because it reframes a concept a lot of people have absorbed as simply obvious, natural, and universal without ever really examining where it actually came from. The specific weight, the specific rules, the specific gendered asymmetry, and even the specific physical proof so much historical and cultural anxiety was built around. All of it turns out to be considerably more constructed, more historically contingent, and more directly traceable to specific economic and inheritance pressures than the popular idea of virginity as some kind of timeless, universal human concern would suggest. The underlying practical concern about paternity confidence is genuinely ancient. The specific shape virginity took as a cultural obsession in any given society, at any given moment in history, was something humans built, not something written into us from the start.